Every piece of land on earth was taken from someone. The chain of legal title, followed back far enough, always ends at a moment of force. That is not a historical footnote. It is the foundation on which every property market, every mortgage, every real estate fortune, every landlord-tenant relationship currently rests. The deed in the filing cabinet is the last document in a chain that began not with a transaction, but with a conquest. And the entire economic order built on top of that foundation inherits its character from the act that began it, whether or not anyone in the chain remembers, acknowledges, or has ever been asked to think about it. Land is unlike any other economic resource, and the failure to see how it is unlike everything else is one of the most consequential intellectual errors in the history of economic thought. Consider what land actually is. It is not produced, no one made it, no factory assembled it, no labor created it. It simply exists, finite, immovable, permanent. The land beneath the city was there before the city. It will be there after the city. The value it holds is not a product of anything its owner did. It is a product of everything everyone around it did. The land beneath a thriving neighborhood is valuable because people built the neighborhood. The land beneath the connected transit hub is valuable because the transit exists. The land in a city is valuable because the city is there. The owner of the land contributed none of this. They simply own the location at which all of it converges. This is what makes land categorically different from capital. Capital, machines, buildings, technology depreciates, it wears out. It requires maintenance, investment, replacement. Capital earns its return through the productive work it enables. Land does not depreciate. Land in a city appreciates automatically as the city grows, as population density increases, as infrastructure improves, as the activity of everyone around it makes the location more valuable. The owner does nothing. The value accrues. This is the purest form of rent, income received not from contribution but from position. The Victorian economist Henry George saw this with unusual clarity in 1879 and wrote a book called Progress and Poverty that became one of the best-selling books of the 19th century. His central observation was stunning in its simplicity. As civilization advances, as cities grow, as productivity increases, the gains of that progress do not flow primarily to workers or to the producers of capital. They flow to landowners. Because every improvement in the surrounding economy increases the value of the land, and the landowner captures that increase without contributing to it. George called this the land value increment. He argued that it was the primary mechanism driving poverty alongside progress. The reason that as societies got richer, large numbers of people remained poor or became poorer. The gains of growth were being captured by those who owned the locations at which growth was happening. Workers produced the growth. Landowners collected the rent. His solution was elegant. Tax the rental value of land entirely, not the buildings on it, not the improvements. The land itself, the locational value created by society rather than by the owner. This single tax, he argued, would eliminate the incentive to hold land speculatively, would make land available for productive use, would fund government entirely, and would return to the public the value that the public had created. It became known as the land value tax. It was implemented partially in several places. It was systematically opposed by those who owned land, which in the 19th century was the same as saying it was systematically opposed by those with political power. The opposition succeeded. The insight was buried. Land economics disappeared from mainstream economic education over the course of the 20th century. Today, most economists are trained in models where land is either absent or treated as a subcategory of capital, as just another asset like a machine or a building that earns a market return. The categorical distinction that George identified, that land is not produced, does not depreciate, and captures value created by everyone else, is simply not in the curriculum. This is not a neutral omission. The disappearance of land from economic thought is the disappearance of the mechanism that most clearly explains why cities price out the people who built them, why housing costs consume larger and larger shares of ordinary incomes even as economies grow, why wealth concentrates in the hands of those who own desirable locations regardless of what they contribute to those locations. Now look at what land ownership does to housing. because this is where the abstraction meets daily life with the most direct and painful force. Housing costs have risen faster than wages in almost every major city in the world over the last 30 years. In London, San Francisco, Sydney, Toronto, New York, Hong Kong, the cost of a home relative to the average income has reached levels that make ownership inaccessible to most people who work in those cities. This is called a housing crisis, and it is attributed to many causes: planning restrictions, construction costs, population growth, interest rates. All of these factors exist. None of them is the primary cause. The primary cause is that land in desirable locations is treated as a speculative asset rather than as a social resource. And like all speculative assets, its price is determined not by its utility, but by the expectation of future price increases. People buy land not only to use it, but to hold it, to capture the appreciation that comes automatically as the city grows around it. Developers hold sites undeveloped, waiting for values to rise further before building. Landowners resist densification not because they oppose housing, but because scarcity of supply protects the value of what they already own. The housing crisis is not a failure of the market. It is the market working exactly as a speculative asset market works, applied to something people cannot do without. The consequence is a transfer of wealth from renters to landlords that has accelerated dramatically over the past 30 years. In the United Kingdom, the total rental income flowing to private landlords grew by more than 300% between 1985 and 2015. The people paying that rent are not getting more housing for their money. They are getting the same housing, the same walls, the same roof, while surrendering a larger and larger portion of their income for the right to occupy a location whose value was created by the city around it, not by the person collecting the rent. A person renting in a city is paying for two things simultaneously: the cost of the physical shelter, the building, the maintenance, the utilities, and the land value, the premium attached to the location, created by the presence of the city, the transit, the employment, the amenity. The first is a genuine service. The second is a tax on urban existence, collected by a private party who contributed nothing to the value they are charging for. This is what George called the unearned increment, and it is not small. In the most desirable cities, the land component of housing costs dwarfs the building component. In London, economists have estimated that more than 70% of average house prices represent land value rather than the cost of the structure. The homeowner or landlord is not primarily selling you a house. They are selling you a location, and they did not create the location. The city did. Now go to the global dimension. Because what land ownership does to cities, colonial land seizure did to entire continents. The history of colonization is, at its economic core, a history of land transfer. The seizure of land from indigenous populations across the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific was the original accumulation on which the wealth of colonial powers was built. Not just as a historical fact, but as a continuing one. The descendants of those who were dispossessed remain, in many cases, without the land wealth that their ancestors held. The descendants of those who seized it retain, directly or through the financial structures built on top of it, the wealth that the seizure produced. In the United States, the wealth gap between black and white Americans is primarily a land wealth gap. The history of slavery, of post-Reconstruction land seizure, of redlining that prevented black families from buying homes in appreciating neighborhoods, of urban renewal that destroyed black communities to build highways, all of it is a history of land, of who was allowed to own it, who was excluded from owning it, and how the appreciation of land value over a century has compounded those exclusions into the wealth disparities visible today. You cannot understand the racial wealth gap without understanding land. You cannot understand urban inequality without understanding land. You cannot understand the housing crisis without understanding land. And you cannot understand any of it if the concept of land has been quietly removed from the economic framework through which you are taught to see the world. Here is the most counterintuitive thing to sit with. Land value taxation, the idea that the location value created by society should be captured by society rather than by private landowners, has more support among economists across the political spectrum than almost any other policy proposal. It is endorsed by economists from the left, from the right, from the center, from libertarians who oppose almost all taxation, from progressives who support aggressive redistribution. The theoretical case for it is extremely strong. The opposition to it is almost entirely from those who own land and have the political power to ensure that the conversation never becomes a policy. This is the pattern throughout this series. The most important mechanisms are the most hidden ones. The concepts most necessary for understanding the economic world you live in are the ones most systematically absent from the education you received within it. Land is perhaps the clearest example of this. A resource that underlies every property market, every housing cost, every urban inequality, every colonial wealth transfer has been made nearly invisible in the framework through which economic life is understood and taught. Now bring this into your body, into the actual experience of where you live and what it costs. If you rent, of everything you earn this month will leave your account and flow to someone who owns a location. The location was not created by them. Its value was created by everyone living and working around it, by the transit infrastructure paid for by everyone's taxes, by the accumulated presence of the city itself. You, for something the city made. Someone else is collecting the payment. If you own, you are benefiting from the same mechanism in reverse. The value of your property is rising not primarily because of anything you have done to it, but because of what is happening around it. You are accumulating wealth created by your neighbors, by the public investments in infrastructure and amenity, by the density and activity of the urban environment. This does not make you a bad person. It makes you a partistem that distributes its gains according to who owns which locations, not according to who contributed what. The question that stays open after all of this is not about policy. It is not about tax rates or planning rules or housing supply. It is more immediate than that. The place you live right now, the location, the neighborhood, the city, who created its value, and who is collecting it.